So I'd like to introduce Dr. Catherine Goodman, who's kind enough to come and talk to us in her whirlwind tour of Italy.
Yes.
Catherine is the senior editor at ACS Publishing.
Senior associate publisher.
Senior associate publisher.
Yes.
At ACS Publishing. And what's the particular journal that you're working with?
Well, I directly work on biochemistry, but my team actually works on about 13 or 14 different journals, so it's kind of a slice across all of the publications.
Broad ambit.
Yeah.
And so what we're going to be talking about today, so right now we just had an amazing talk about AI in publishing, and several of the things that we've discussed also involve careers in publishing, and that's one of the main things that we'd like to discuss. So we're going to be talking a bit about that today, and I'm going to be asking you some questions about this. So one of the first things I'd like to talk about is your background. So what drew you to science publishing?
Yeah, so I went to graduate school because I had that one fabulous undergraduate professor that made me think, not only do I want to study chemistry because his class was so amazing, but I want to then be him and inspire the next generation of researchers. So I got about partway through my PhD and realized that being a professor is a ton of work. You know, the writing grants, writing papers, training new students, and having that continual turnover of students was not actually what I wanted to do. But I wasn't quite sure, so I went ahead and did a postdoc. And then by the end of my postdoc, I realized I'm ready to be done in the lab. But what I loved throughout that process was talking to people about science, learning about science, getting to think about science at a really high and broad level. And I had kind of developed some skills where I had become the go-to person in my lab, that when someone needs a paper edited, oh, Catherine will take a look. And beyond just editing the language cleanups kind of thing, I found I really got drawn into how can I make this paper really sing, really bring out the excitement of the work and help other people to appreciate it. So eventually someone pointed me to science publishing as a possible career, and I realized it was a perfect overlap of getting to help authors, not just in my lab, but around the world and around the community, publish their work and get to highlight it.
Okay, brilliant. And how did you start up then? What was your first job in science publishing?
Yeah, it's a very boring story. I saw the job posted in Nature Chemical Biology. They were looking for someone with a bioorganic background, and that's my own background. Sorry, microphone. And so I put in an application and they called and we went through the process. It's a pretty involved process, multiple tests that they have you do and writing samples, and finally you go on site and do some additional, like a deep dive into kind of manuscript analysis. And in the end, they offered me the position and I took it.
Fantastic. So how would you describe your transition? How did it feel to be transitioning away from academia to publishing?
Yeah, it was definitely a big culture shift. For one, you could wear clothes that you didn't worry about getting organic solvents on, and that wouldn't get ruined by being in the lab. I think the biggest change was kind of having to be answerable to your authors in a way that your job just becomes much more than about you and your own research. So if someone's trying to get a revision done and they need to talk to me about those experiments, I need to make myself available to them, whether they're in one town over, the next state, 12 hours apart. So really being on the job a lot more than I was used to was different. Even as a graduate student, it felt like more hours. And I think just kind of the weight of the responsibility that you had, I remember some people writing in their cover letter, if I don't get this paper published, I don't get tenure. And that is a huge burden for someone to take on. So it definitely made me really feel that it was not a trivial job. I really had to put my full focus and intellect into the role. So those were probably the biggest changes.
Yeah, interesting. And how would you describe your progression? So that's almost 20 years ago now, and how Sorry. And how would you talk about the progression that you had over those years to where you are now?
So I think I really enjoyed my time at Nature Chemical Biology. I had a great group of co-editors. I got to go to some amazing conferences and learn about really interesting science. I got to publish some neat special issues. I think over time, as with many of the volume restricted journals, you spend a lot more of your time telling people no than yes. So we published about 5 to 10% of what was submitted. So not only the people who you just reject immediately, but the people that maybe you work through several rounds of revision and then it's just not going to work out and you're having to tell them no. I found it was really impacting my psyche to always be looking for what's wrong with this paper because I have to reject more papers. And in fact, a lot of the papers were amazing and it felt kind of arbitrary after a while. So I was ready for something different. So that's this new position at JBC, Journal of Biological Chemistry, opened up, and it was behind the scenes. So I get to support the editors rather than be the editor. And I thought that would be a good change of pace.
Okay, brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay, and how do you feel about what you're doing right now? Because right now you're then overseeing quite a few journals.
Right.
Effectively.
Yeah, so again, it's a still behind the scenes kind of role. We're supporting the editors, we're helping them shape their vision, we're helping them execute that vision, but I don't have to be the person to say no, which I love.
Sounds way better.
Yes. Now I have the other side, which is I have to make sure people stay within their budgets, which I hate. I would love to just spend all the money, but that's not realistic. So no, now it's more about, how can we make these journals serve the community in the most impactful and effective way? How can we continue to find, what's new and exciting in the field and celebrate that and bring visibility to both the work and our terrific authors? Okay,
fantastic. So I just want to know, how do you feel that publishing, specifically scientific publishing, has changed over your career? Mm-hmm. So over the time, how do you feel that it's the relation between you and authors has changed?
Yeah, I think the part of what we were talking about earlier today was just that publishing has evolved in some ways for good and some ways for bad. I think there's, or at least the way that the community interacts with publishing. So I would say there's more and more pressure on researchers to publish in specific ways at specific journals that I think is not healthy and gets away from just appreciating great science. In other ways, I think that, super powerful search engines have democratized science to take you to the right paper you need, regardless of whether it's published at Journal A or Journal B. I think that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, and in terms of careers, so your career path was quite clear, I think. So once you left postdocing, you then sort of took the path from editorial and then to step back to further away from the clients, the authors, technically. Yeah. How would you say that type of career path would be if you were starting now? Yeah,
so the job that I started in still exists now, and in fact, the high-profile, high-impact journals continue to expand, so there are more and more need for professional editors. And really, most of the professional editors do come directly from, at least in the time I was there, and I know there's still open calls for, we're looking for someone who can be straight out of their PhD or postdoc. Coming in with publishing experience is great, but they have a super involved on-the-job training to make sure you're doing good service to your authors. So people who are interested in that career, you just go to the job boards and which journal is hiring, and even if it says they're looking for a materials scientist and you're a physics person, it's still worth applying, because for one, what they think of as materials may be a fit or close enough to what you could handle. And for two, maybe there's some flexibility on the existing team where they could still bring you on if you're the right person. So I would say go ahead and forge ahead. And there's also, for the kind of behind the scenes roles, like at ACS and RSC and some other society journals, again, there's, I have an open position right now, and it's, if you Google work at ACS, then the job ad comes right up, looking for a managing editor. And basically the thing to watch out for is, the job description will be pretty clear about whether you're directly handling papers, whether it's a copy editing kind of role, whether it's a journal administrator kind of role. Just read carefully. And also, I've done a ton of informational interviews, so if you have any interest in the field and want to get into it, obviously people can find me on LinkedIn. There's tons of us in the publishing community that, everyone has to get started somehow, and so feel free to reach out and learn more.
That's fantastic, because I think one of the things that a lot of people coming from an academic background get a bit intimidated by is that when you're very used to being focused on your own research, and then suddenly when you see job advertisements, even when you think, oh, this is something I would really like to do, you see the description and think I couldn't possibly do that, or maybe they wouldn't take me because I have no experience in publishing. And so a lot of people, it's quite a nice thing to hear that people could move in and maybe not look so closely at the fine points of the job description, from what you're saying, I think.
Yeah. I mean, the cover letters that stand out to me are people who understand what science publishing is at all, which is not a given. People who understand they'll be moving away from research, and people who can explain why they're passionate about wanting to switch careers in a way that you're not going to be at the bench, you're not writing grants, and that you've clearly thought about that and have some motivation for the role. I would definitely, for my last open role, I think I had first interviews with maybe 40 people because I wanted to just get the broadest brush possible about who all these interesting people are and how their research career could translate to a publishing career. So,
okay, fantastic. And what would the sort of interview process be like for your average, let's say, for example, someone who's just out of their PhD or just out of their postdoc? And not had experience in publishing. So this is someone who's coming in cold. How would their interview application process be, like a typical process? Sure.
So I think at ACS, in the more kind of behind the scenes roles, the kinds of things that we would be interested in finding out is, what is someone's motivation? What is someone's level of patience for, some of the editors that you work with are going to be fabulous, wonderful people who understand your role and how you work together. Some people don't understand what your role is and think you're their administrative assistant. And how do you manage some of those challenging personalities? So someone who can kind of roll with the punches and who can keep on top of, being able to talk about how you stay on top of both long-term priorities and deal with the day-to-day administrative tasks where things have to move forward, but you can't lose sight of that thing that's due 7 months from now. Those are the kinds of people that we need. For my first role, it's much heavier into the science because you're the one actively reading the science, and you need to become comfortable with, unless it's a very specialized role, you're going to be handling science that's not in your immediate expertise. And so how do you kind of make the best of that and bring enough of your own scientific credentials to bear to understand, should I send this out to review? If so, who are the right experts, etc.
And how do you feel people handle that? Because that seems to be the nuts and bolts, the hardest bit of the transition is stepping away from by the time someone has a PhD or a postdoc behind them, they're very specialized, and at that point when they join your team or a team like yours, suddenly they're having to step back and look at all this general material. I mean, do people handle it? Is there a learning curve that can be quite steep for some people more than others?
Yeah, I think, so I unintentionally prepared myself perfectly for this career because in my PhD I worked on gold nanoparticles, organic synthesis, protein mimetics, protein folding, materials characterization. I don't know what else. Then in my postdoc, I did some protein design, but I also did some membrane proteins, but I also, so
it's broad enough.
Having a broad interest, whether or not you get to express it in actually the research that you're doing, having a broad interest helps a lot. I do remember we interviewed someone for a role back at Nature Chemical Biology who had been working in, I don't want to give them away, so let's say a biosynthesis lab. That's not the truth, but we'll hide it. And they specifically said at the end of my PhD, I wanted to really broaden out and learn something totally different. So I went to this other biosynthesis lab. And so that was a clue, along with other things that they said during their interview, that they would really struggle with being pushed outside those boundaries.
Okay, yeah, because they're already their idea of broad was maybe a bit different to yours.
Yes.
So on the way here, we discussed a little bit this idea of the leaky pipelines. So there's often this analogy that people make about physics sort of loses these people. These people sort of dribble out of physics as they go on towards the sort of final role of being a professor. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about the fact that this actually happens. Firstly, it can actually be quite a positive thing for people to leave academia and find other things that they find interesting that are still connected to science, but also that this happens at different stages in people's careers. Mm-hmm. So do you have some experience of dealing with people who sort of finish their masters and then go out, or finish their PhD and then go out, or finish their postdoc? And maybe if you'd like to say something about that.
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the most interesting facts that confronted me in recent years, I kept getting invited to these alternative career panels, and at some point someone who was on a panel with me said, actually it's the professors that are the alternative careers, because it's only 5 or 10%, some very small number of people who enter academia, even as graduate students, go on to become professors. So it's the fact that people come up through this academic system and that's what they see all around them, that they think this is what everyone does because this is what everyone around me is doing. But the universe is much wider. And I think at any point that someone feels like I have completed my time in the lab, there are always opportunities to exit and do something else. So the roles that I'm currently hiring for right now, I think a master's in science is required, but a PhD is optional. And we're seeing some people come in with postdocs, some people coming in, having spent time as professors, but we're open to anyone who's a good fit for the role. And I think it's, you would know better than I've heard from some science communicators that actually having a more advanced, more niche, more deep into the weeds degree can actually be to your detriment, because you lose some of that broad knowledge and interest.
You become a bit less fluid.
Right. So I think it's, we have to get away from this culture where if you step away from the bench, you failed in some way. It's just, I see what the role of professor is, and that's not for me. Where else do we go from here?
Yeah, this is a nice way of thinking about it, I think, is that this is a natural career path, actually, from research. And you retain quite a lot. I mean, it sounds like you talk about the journals and the authors with quite a lot of passion.
Yes,
I mean, so you still have that. So you've retained that from your research days.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I just last week was at a conference. That's why I'm here in Italy, and really meeting the people who are still doing the research and having the bright ideas, and then seeing those play out in the lab. That is what keeps me energized for a career in publishing, because those are the results we're publishing, and those are the people we're impacting, and then whoever can read those papers to inspire the next great idea. That's really what this is about.
Brilliant. So I'd just like to ask you a couple more questions. So firstly, what do you see happening with the future of the job market in scientific publishing? Are there any trends that you'd like to
It
discuss?
is interesting because, the way that the scientific community is set up, there's more and more research. There will be more and more publications to serve that research, whether it's more niche topics to fit the role for a specific community, or more publishers attempting to have the next big journal, whatever it is. And those require humans to help support the journals. As you mentioned, we were talking earlier about AI, and will the need for humans decrease as more things can be automated? Undoubtedly. But there's still a human element required. And I think one of the fun things about science publishing, science communication, scientific outreach is once you kind of start thinking about how can I help science get out to an audience, who the audience is matters, of course, but not so much. I mean, if science publishing fired all the humans and I was like, maybe I'll try writing, I don't know if I'd be good at it, but it would still be, it would scratch that itch of how do I talk to people about science. So I think it is transferable in some ways that once you kind of enter this large domain, you can look around a little bit to find your right spot.
So would you say that there's quite a lot of room for maneuver in science publishing at this point?
Yeah. And I mean, that can be from maneuvering from publisher to publisher, from from institutional press office to CNN contributor, Chemical and Engineering News contributor, that's an ACS publication. There's definitely room to move around. Depending on your interests.
Brilliant. Okay, so last question.
Yes.
What advice would you give to someone starting out now? So someone who is towards their end of their PhD or master's, towards the end of what they think is probably going to be their last postdoc. Mm-hmm. And they're seriously similar to you and perhaps me. I mean, it's similar to this kind of like, I was the one in the lab who always wrote the papers type of person.
Right.
What advice would you give them?
I would say, a lot of senior students are going to conferences, whether it's, in person, virtual, et cetera. Look for people who are outside of that academic track, ask them questions, get to know what the opportunities are, find the right job sites to be looking for. A lot of publishers kind of hide their editorial work on the publisher page rather than putting them on some of the more generic job searching. So I remember in my postdoc when I was looking for jobs, I would spend a ridiculous amount of time, and hopefully this is outdated, going to the ACS website and the Nature website and the whatever website to track down all the opportunities. Like I said, if you see someone on LinkedIn and you're like, their job sounds really interesting, reach out for an informational interview, or ask them. I have a couple of things I've written that describe my role in years past that I can just send you a link, and that's more information than you had before, with very little effort from me. So I would just say, start doing your homework. Don't assume that just because you don't want to go this path that's set before you, this academic path, that you're kind of stuck. Like, you have help, and talk to your alumni office at your university, in your department. What are people doing now that is roles that aren't professors? And in fact, invite them back and have them talk to the whole department to educate everyone. So just get out there and hunt down what you want. Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much for talking to us, Catherine. This has been so useful. It's been such a delight to be here. Thank you so much for hosting me. Okay, thank you.